Let's break down every single player that you could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire last minute heading into week 7 of the 2024 fantasy football season to help you dominate the week. Start the video with Alexander Mattison of the Las Vegas Raiders, and I swear Alexander Mattison has been in every single one of these videos and maybe every single one of the beginning of the week waiver wire videos throughout the whole season, but here we are again, sitting at 63% rostered with Mattison, a top 25 running back in fantasy football. Are you going to get something crazy out of Mattison this week? No, but if he's out there available in your league and you need a spot play, he is the definition of a spot play going into the week. Has a good matchup against the LA Rams. This is a road game for the Raiders, and yes, I mean, we could maybe expect some volatility out of this offense for the Rams with Aiden O'Connell at quarterback on the road here, but when we break it down so far on the season, double digits in every game for Mattison except for week 2 and week 4. He still at least scored a touchdown in week 2. I know Zamir White, has missed the last 2 weeks, and as awful as Zamir White has been, he's gotten, good amount of touches, 9 or more touches in every game he's played in, but he has logged some practices this week, but is still listed as questionable going into this game. And I mean, if Zamir White plays or doesn't play, it doesn't really bother me. Mattison is a player who's going to get the bulk of the touches, get the work in the receiving game, and get that goal line work is what we've seen on the season so far. 17.5 fantasy points in week 6 for Mattison. And don't forget, he had a touchdown that was called back in that game as well, so he should have had an even bigger overall performance. So all I'm going to say, if Mattison's out there, you need a play this week, he will probably get you through the week. He is the Raiders running back to own from a fantasy perspective as we approach week 7. You want to break down the Colts running back, so let's start with Trey Sermon, who was god-awful in week 6. 18 touches for 29 total rushing yards, just 1.61 yards per carry after having 18.3 fantasy points against the Jacksonville Jaguars in week 5. So, bad run defense in week 5, pretty good run defense in week 6. Awful run defense here in week 7 against the Miami Dolphins. I know Trey Sermon has probably broke your trust, but he's sitting at 32% rostered. If you need a spot play, I don't want to give up fully on Trey Sermon as the Miami Dolphins are giving up the second most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. So there's definitely a little bit of risk here because we're also seeing involvement out of Tyler Goodson, who sits at 10% rostered. He had 8 touches last week, 5 targets, and 4 receptions. He sits at just 10% rostered. So, this is one of those things where you can kind of take your best guess here, but I do think that Sermon will potentially get some goal line work and have an opportunity to score in this game. I think that Goodson potentially has more upside in the receiving game, but they're both viable options against this Dolphins run defense. Like I said, giving up the second most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. So listen, this is a desperation play. This is probably going to continue to be a short-term play as Jonathan Taylor is still nursing that ankle injury. When Jonathan Taylor comes back, we can move past this committee backfield for the Colts. But for now, if you need a spot play, you can take a chance on either Sermon or Goodson, purely based on the fact that they have an incredible matchup at home against the Dolphins here in week 7. All right, let's stick with the AFC South and let's take a look at Dameon Pierce sitting at just 18% rostered. Now, obviously, this is Joe Mixon's backfield. That was proven in week 6 against the Patriots without a doubt. So I'm not going to get too excited here. But when it comes to Dameon Pierce, I do think he's the clear-cut RB2 on this team. Now that Cam Akers has been traded to the Vikings, Dare Ogunbowale will maybe get, some pass catching work here and there and have some moments, but I just don't think we can trust Dare from a fantasy perspective. And I'm not really ready to necessarily trust Dameon Pierce either. But 8 touches last week, 76 total yards, 9.5 yards per carry, a touchdown, and added 1 catch. Now, he had the one big play, the one big run for a touchdown. So we take that away, then, maybe we're just looking at this from a very, very different perspective. But I think at the end of the day, He is still a handcuff running back to Joe Mixon, and we know what we will get out of Dameon Pierce if he has to step up and be the RB1 for the Houston Texans. So I'm not really expecting anything this week. The Packers are top 15 against the running back position. This is a road game, of course, for the Texans, but really we're just looking at an opportunity to be able to pick up a running back, or a handcuff running back, I should say, while they're still lowly rostered, and also a running back that is a part of a great offense as well. So we've already seen Mixon get banged up once through the course of this season. He's a veteran running back. I hope he doesn't get hurt again, but if he does, we want to go ahead and kind of beat that potential fight for Dameon Pierce on the waiver wire, and things are just way more clear-cut with this backfield now with Cam Akers being traded. So once again, one big play last week against a bad run defense for the New England Patriots, but maybe I'm not expecting that to happen this week against the Green Bay Packers. But there could certainly be plenty of opportunity for Dameon Pierce to be a viable fantasy option if we do see something happen to Mixon this season again, so he becomes just a strong handcuff, good offense with the Texans that we want to try and roster now before it becomes far more difficult to do so in later weeks, potentially. All right, next up, let's talk about Kimani Vidal of the LA Chargers, a player that I've talked about here and there throughout the week. And listen, once again, I want to be careful chasing points here. 13.1 fantasy points against a good Denver Broncos run defense last week. 4 rushing attempts, 11 total yards, 2 targets, 2 receptions, 40 receiving yards, and that receiving touchdown. So it's a very good matchup this week against the Arizona Cardinals, who have struggled against the running back position, giving up the 25th most fantasy points to the running back position so far on the season. But this is J.K. Dobbins' backfield. We know that. We also know that this is a run-first offense, Jim Harbaugh system, and they're probably going to want to spell J.K. Dobbins at times. And we've got, Gus Bus currently on the IR. We looked through the first 2 games of the season. Gus Edwards had 11 touches in week 1, 18 in week 2. The touches did go down in weeks 3 and 4, but, Dobbins' touches were down in those games against Pittsburgh and Kansas City as well. Got Hassan Haskins on this roster, but he has 5 touches on the entire season. So Kimani Vidal, nice explosiveness, exciting prospect going into his rookie season, right? Could definitely bring some upside to the passing game potentially, but also maybe to the run game as well. So yeah, this is maybe more of a handcuff situation, but this could also turn into a situation where the Chargers are giving Kimani Vidal touches behind J.K. Dobbins as well, and he's able to produce from a fantasy standpoint off of those touches. So Vidal sits at just 23% rostered. He could end up having a big week on Monday Night Football against the Cardinals. Gets a couple good matchups in the next 2 weeks against the Saints and the Browns. So we'll see what happens here, but I think you want to try and roster Kimani Vidal right now as opposed to having to fight for him later. And I think if you're desperate, you could cross your fingers and plug him in this week against the Arizona Cardinals. All right, last running back I want to talk about is Antonio Gibson of the New England Patriots, who I will admit I have very little faith in, but we've got another questionable week coming out of Ramondre Stevenson, dealing with that foot injury that kept him out of action in week 6 against the Texans. So the main thing here is we got an early game here on Sunday between the Patriots and the Jaguars and London. And the key word there is Jaguars. This defense is awful, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the running back position. Awful against wide receivers, tight ends, and quarterbacks in fantasy scoring allowed as well. If Gibson's a starter here, I know this one's tough because he got you to 7.3 fantasy points in week 6. Had the debacle in week 5 when Stevenson was supposed to, be benched, and then Gibson came out with just 6.6 fantasy points in that game. I'm going to, proceed with caution here, but if you need a spot play, he sits at 46% rostered, and this matchup is very, very good. So I'll just leave it at that. You're desperate. He's out there and available in your league, and Stevenson does not play. Then we can plug and play Antonio Gibson here in week 7. Next up, let's talk about some wide receivers. Let's take a look at Juju Smith-Schuster, who has been nursing a hamstring injury throughout the week, but he is expected to play against the San Francisco 49ers on Sunday. Sits at 51% rostered on bye week in week 6. We go back to week 5 against the Saints. 8 targets, 7 receptions, 130 receiving yards, 20 fantasy points. So honestly, I know a lot of people are, a little wary of picking up Juju chasing points, all that stuff. But I'm also surprised he's only sitting at 51% rostered because Kansas City Chiefs players have this effect, especially when there's injuries and it's the next man up, right? I mean, look at how many people ran to the waiver wire to pick up Samaje Perine and Carson Steele, who've done next to nothing since Isaiah Pacheco got injured, So I'm just a little bit surprised that Juju's sitting at just halfway rostered across fantasy leagues. But if he's out there and available, it's not particularly the best matchup this week. It's also not the worst. Like, this has been a very up and down defense for the San Francisco 49ers. They are giving up the 15th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, so kind of right there in the middle. But sometimes we get good performances out of them. Sometimes we don't. The Chiefs are on the road, but I was going to say, if Juju's out there and available, I think he's a good play this week. And yeah, maybe he's not going to get you 20 fantasy points, but he should certainly be involved in this offense as the season continues to progress. So he's out there, he's available. I think overall he's worth picking up, and I think he's a viable play here in week 7. Next up is Demario Douglas of the New England Patriots, and this is probably my favorite player on today's list overall. When I first put together the list, he was sitting at like 46% rostered. He's already shot up to 51% rostered at the time I'm recording this. Double-digit fantasy points in the last 4 weeks. 21.2 in week 6 against the Texans. 9 targets, 6 receptions, 92 receiving yards, and a touchdown in Drake Maye's first start. Now here in week 7, once again, we have a great matchup against the Jacksonville Jaguars, giving up the second most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. And this is your wide receiver 1 on the Patriots, okay? Maybe we see other guys get involved, like Jalen Polk. Kayshon Boutte caught a touchdown last week. There's other names here, but this is the best overall wide receiver on this team, hands down. And this is too good of a matchup to ignore. I'm also a little bit surprised that he's still just sitting at 51% rostered, given that in full PPR, he has scored double digits in 3 of the last 4 games, and he's coming off of a very strong performance in a, kind of playing from behind garbage time type game for the Patriots against the Texans, but nonetheless, 21.2 fantasy points last week, and we literally can start just about anyone against the Jacksonville Jaguars. That's how bad their defense is. So if Pop Douglas is out there and available in your league, I think he's a great play here in week 7. But I also think he's going to have value as the season goes on. He does have a couple of tough matchups coming up. The Jets in week 8, the Bears in week 10. But overall, I think he is worth rostering. He's going to be a good spot play at times, a viable flex option as the season progresses. So if he's out there and available in your league, I would go and pick him up right now. I also love his current line on Underdog, sitting at 47.5 total receiving yards. He has hit that in weeks 3, 5, and 6. So in those 3, the last 4 matchups where he had double-digit fantasy points, he also hit this receiving line. And like I said, he gets the Jacksonville Jaguars this week. Fantastic matchup. I would head straight to Underdog, take the over on his receiving yards. Don't forget, new users who sign up with promo code TheCatch, that link is down below, are going to receive a free pick'em to use towards week 7. Pair it with the over on Demario Douglas's receiving yards, automatically triple your cash entry. And while you're doing so, Underdog is going to give you a 50% deposit match up to $1,000 when you sign up with promo code TheCatch. All right, next up is Xavier Legette of the Carolina Panthers, who I think for, a lot of fantasy managers has just become a player that they don't trust. He sits at just 41% rostered, 1.8 fantasy points against a good Chicago Bears secondary in week 5. But then you look at the last 2 performances outside of that, 19.6 against the Bengals, 11.3 last week against the Atlanta Falcons, including a receiving touchdown. And this week, he has a fantastic matchup against the Washington Commanders, who are one of the worst secondaries in the entire league, giving up the 29th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So Xavier Legette is a viable flex option if you're struggling at, your flex spot going into week 7. And I think overall, while maybe he's not my favorite player to hold on to, he's going to have moments where he scores on the season. As long as Andy Dalton or somewhat competent quarterback is playing quarterback for the Panthers, Couple tough matchups on the stretch here. I mean, Denver in week 8, the Giants in week 10, Kansas City in week 12, but there's going to be moments where we can spot play Xavier Legette. So I think he's worth rostering in a lot of circumstances. But overall, if you just need someone to spot play here in week 7, Xavier Legette against the Commanders definitely has a good shot at double-digit fantasy points. Next up is Jordan Whittington of the LA Rams, who is listed as questionable going into the week with a shoulder injury, but sits at just 20% rostered, and in his last 2 starts, weeks 4 and 5, 12 or more fantasy points, and just really looks like the Rams wide receiver that we want to own. Now, Cooper Kupp, officially questionable for week 7. He might play. That doesn't panic me. That actually makes me like Whittington a little bit more because now you have the primary defensive pressure on Cooper Kupp, and that opens things up for Whittington even more, who I think is going to come in nicely as the wide receiver 2 on this team. Now, there's always some risk with these Rams pass catchers because you still got Demarcus Robinson, Tutu Atwell, Tyler Johnson all looming around, but Whittington really felt like the true wide receiver 1, at least at the end of the stretch with no Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, looking back to weeks 4 and 5. 8 targets in week 4, 10 targets in week 5. So don't get me wrong, there's always some volatility because these other guys like Tutu Atwell, Demarcus Robinson, whatever, they can all get involved here. But Jordan Whittington is a player that I want to own. There's plenty of good matchups coming up. Minnesota, Seattle, Miami, New England, Philly, New Orleans in the next couple weeks. So whether Puka's there or Kupp's there or they're not there, I think Whittington is the most talented and the next guy up in this offense. And the Rams wide receiver we want to own, even if you're just stashing him and putting him on your bench. I think Whittington should be rostered in more leagues approaching week 7. All right, next up is Tre Tucker of the Raiders, who I understand is going to be very, very difficult to trust. I mean, we had some weeks there where we could stream Tre Tucker, did some things in weeks 3 and 4, and then has completely fell off the map here in weeks 5 and 6. Once again, having opportunities with no Devontae Adams, and then Jacoby Myers banged up, and here we have Jacoby Myers doubtful to play against the Rams here in week 7, and that's going to leave Tucker as the wide receiver 1. I mean, we got DJ Turner, and that's about it when we look at the wide receiver position here. So I'll put it this way. Denver, tough matchup. Pittsburgh, tough matchup. The Rams, however, giving up the 24th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, I'm not going to consider that a tough matchup. So listen, this is a desperation play. Maybe a player we can stash to a degree, but he hits the bye week in week 10, and after this week he gets Kansas City and Cincinnati. Like, I don't know if we're really going to want to hold on to Tre Tucker. Plus, Myers is going to come back in the next week or two, so it's going to take away that volume. And even if Tucker's lining up as a wide receiver 1, the primary pass catcher on this team is Brock Bowers. But if you need a spot play, you're desperate, you're in a deeper format, whatever it is, Tucker against the Rams should at least come away with some points and have a better opportunity than he did against those tough defenses in the Steelers and the Broncos in the last 2 weeks. Next up is Rashod Bateman of the Baltimore Ravens, and this is a player that I really like as a pickup going into week 7, sitting at 22% rostered, has a great matchup against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. I'm expecting points in this game. I'm expecting a little bit of a shootout. This should be a fun Monday night game, and the Bucs are giving up the 21st most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. On the other hand, the Ravens are giving up the most fantasy points to the wide receiver position. So, yeah, I'm expecting 2 high-powered offenses, Baker Mayfield, Lamar Jackson, primetime football. I'm expecting points here, and Bateman has double-digit fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 matchups, 2 touchdowns in 2 of his last 4 matchups. He's been pretty involved, and he's definitely a player that this probably feels difficult to trust, but I think he's a lock once again for double digits this week. Maybe the ceiling's not crazy high here, but I think another, 12-ish fantasy point performance is very doable for Bateman in this matchup, and he's very lowly rostered overall, sitting at just 22% rostered. So Bateman is out there and available. He's a great spot play, and honestly, he's starting to look enough involved in this offense that you can probably just stick to your roster. And we know this is arguably the best offense in the entire league in the Baltimore Ravens. So might be a little bit spotty because they can do a lot of different things with this offense and they can run all over teams and all that stuff. But Bateman, I think he's a good pickup going into week 7, and I think he could also be a very good play as we go into week 7. All right, then very quickly, I'm just going to mention Ricky Pearsall of the San Francisco 49ers, and for me, this is really a stash. Proceed with caution. I don't know how many snaps Ricky Pearsall is going to get this week, but it does look like Ricky Pearsall will be active after suffering, being shot in the offseason. Incredible that he's back, ready to play here in week 7. Awesome story. Very happy for him. A prospect that I really liked going into the year. So this is great news. But this is a tough matchup in week 7 against the Kansas City Chiefs. It's a home game, so there's that. But I just don't know how many snaps we're actually going to see out of Ricky Pearsall. Plus, we still got Debo, Ayuk, and Jawan Jennings clearly in front of Pearsall on this team at the moment. But he could end up being a good overall stash. Even though those 3 wide receivers are in front of him on the roster, Jawan Jennings is set to miss this week dealing with a hip injury. And we've seen, at least some buzz around rookie wide receiver Jacob Cowing as well, who's, been active throughout the whole year, but hasn't done anything on the field. So be interesting to see, but Ricky Pearsall is certainly going to have a chance to potentially do something. And I think, once again, a prospect that a lot of us, dynasty players, fantasy managers liked going into the season. So overall, he's just at 19% rostered. If you have room to stash him, if you're in a deeper format, he could definitely be worth the waiver addition here as we approach week 7. Very quickly, let's go over some quarterbacks and tight ends. And let's start with Sam Darnold sitting at 66% rostered. So may or may not be out there in your league, but if he is floating around, I'll say even if you're pretty confident in your quarterback 1, if Darnold is available, I think you might as well just go pick him up, okay? This stretch that the Vikings are about to go on, the Lions this week. I know the Lions looked fantastic this past week, but I'm expecting some points out of both teams in this week 7 matchup. But good game script at the very least. But then after that, the Rams, the Colts, the Jags, the Titans, the Bears, the Cardinals, the Falcons, the Bears, the Seahawks, then a week 17 good game script matchup against the Green Bay Packers, who we already saw a shootout between these two earlier in the season in week 4. This schedule is fantastic overall for the Vikings offense and for Sam Darnold. So if he's out there, I know some people are kind of thinking like the week 5 performance was bad. Is Sam Darnold even good? Are their wheels going to fall off like they did with Derek Carr, right? I think that Sam Darnold is going to be just fine. I think this stretch is going to be really, really impactful for fantasy football. So he's a good play here in week 7. I'm expecting points between the Vikings and the Lions. And overall, for the next couple of weeks and throughout the entire fantasy season, I think Sam Darnold is going to be very solid. If he's out there and available, scoop him up right now, because I don't think you're going to be able to do so as the next couple weeks go on. Need a streaming option. I'm going to go ahead and just talk about Trevor Lawrence, who's been a streaming option the last 3 weeks of fantasy football for the most part. Just 14.7 fantasy points in week 4, so maybe just the last 2 weeks, but close to 15 fantasy points in week 4, 22 fantasy points in week 5, 18 fantasy points last week. Has thrown at least 2 touchdowns in the last 3 games. So the Patriots are giving up the 10th fewest fantasy points to opposing quarterbacks, but I don't know. They also just got shredded last week by the Texans. Very different team than the Jaguars, but we got good pass catchers here with Brian Thomas, Evan Engram, Christian Kirk. We got enough running backs between Tank Bigsby, Dearness Johnson, and don't forget about Travis Etienne. So I know that this Jaguars offense just feels like something you want to stay away from, but there's still plenty of good playmakers on this offense. And the nice thing with the Jaguars is their defense is so bad that this offense consistently needs to throw the football with Trevor Lawrence. So that benefits Trevor Lawrence from a fantasy perspective. So he sits at just 44% rostered. You need someone to plug and play. I do like Trevor Lawrence, but I will go ahead and say, if you want to go with maybe a little bit of a riskier play that maybe has more upside, Drake Maye sits at 25% rostered in that same matchup, coming off of a 21.5 fantasy day against the Texans with 3 total passing touchdowns and 243 passing yards, 2 picks, and a lost fumble as well. But rookie in his first start, and the Jaguars are giving up the most fantasy points to the quarterback position. Maybe a little bit more volatility here because we've only seen Drake Maye in 1 total start, But Drake Maye, Trevor Lawrence, both should be good enough streamers as we head into week 7. Let's break down these tight ends very quickly. Let's start with Cade Otton of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who has a great matchup as the Ravens are giving up the 23rd most fantasy points to the tight end position. We already talked about that matchup briefly. I'm expecting points, 2 good offenses, 2 bad secondaries. Cade Otton's in a very good spot here in week 7. He's at 7.4 or more fantasy points in each of the last 4 starts. And with how bad tight ends have been a majority of the season, that's pretty good overall. 9.5 fantasy points in week 6, a touchdown that kind of saved his fantasy stat line, but overall still got him a touchdown, right? So Cade Otton sitting at just 41% rostered. One of these guys that has some fluctuation at the tight end position, but that's what you get when you're streaming tight end. If he's out there and available, I think he is a strong start in week 7. I also think Zach Ertz is once again a very strong start. This was my favorite streaming tight end going into last week. He had a good matchup against the Ravens, the team we just mentioned. He's got a great matchup once again here against the Carolina Panthers in week 7, giving up the 29th most points to the tight end position. 10.8 fantasy points for Ertz in week 6 against the Ravens, 5 targets, 4 receptions, 68 receiving yards. I mean, really, when you look at this offense, he's essentially the wide receiver 2 on this team. I mean, maybe Austin Eckler is, but you got Terry McLaurin, and then you don't really have another wide receiver on a consistent basis stepping up for the Washington Commanders. So Ertz, part of a great offense, great system here, an offense that's humming behind rookie quarterback Jaden Daniels. Sitting at 40% roster, this is just a player that will probably get you a safe floor and doesn't have a tremendous amount of upside. He does have a good matchup like he does here in week 7 against the Panthers. These are the times that we want to pick him up and stream him. So if he's out there available, you need help at tight end, he's a solid option moving into week 7. Final tight end is going to be Hunter Henry of the New England Patriots. Once again, I think we have a New England Patriots player for every position in today's video, but it's just another fantastic matchup as the Jaguars defense just struggles against every position, giving up the 30th most fantasy points to the tight end position. Cade Otton, 2 touchdowns last week in that London matchup with the Bears. Hunter Henry sits at 28% roster. He definitely has fluctuation as a tight end, right? You look at 18.9 fantasy points in week 2, then 2.9, 3.2, 5.2. Then 13.1 last week, but once again, Drake Maye's first start. Maybe there's some chemistry between Maye and Hunter Henry. We'll find out. 5 targets, 3 receptions, 41 receiving yards, a touchdown in week 6. It's a very good matchup this week. He's lower rostered overall. If you need a tight end to plug and play, he's a great spot play and a fantastic matchup against the Jaguars here in week 7. That'll do it for today's video. There's every single player at every single position that you guys could possibly need to add off of the waiver wire last minute as we approach week 7 of the season. Don't forget, guys, I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comments section down below. If you guys need anything whatsoever as we approach the week, drop me a comment. I'll answer every single comment on this video before Sunday's games kick off. And don't forget, we have everything you could possibly need here on the channel for week 7 of the season. So make sure you guys are subscribed so that you're not missing out on any of the content. If you guys are looking for more fantasy content, check out all the videos on the channel. We've got everything you could possibly need for the week. And with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, we saw it here on The Catch.